The morning sun of June 4th, 1942, cast long shadows across the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stared through his binoculars at the horizon. What should have been a routine bombardment of Midway, Toll had become a nightmare of contradictory orders and tactical confusion. The carefully orchestrated surprise attack that had brought Japan such stunning victories at Pearl Harbor and across the Pacific was unraveling before his eyes. "Sir, reconnaissance reports American carriers approaching from the northeast." Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda burst onto the bridge, his usual composure shattered. The intelligence had been wrong, devastatingly wrong. The Americans weren't retreating. They were attacking with everything they had. Nagumo's mind raced as he processed the implications. His strike force, spread across 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, was caught in the worst possible position. Half his aircraft were armed for ground attack against Midway's installations, while the other half waited below decks, being hastily rearmed for naval combat. The coordination that had made the combined fleet unstoppable was fracturing under the pressure of American audacity. From the command center of the Yorktown, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher watched the unfolding drama through the eyes of his scout planes. The Japanese had walked directly into the trap that Admiral Chester Nimitz had set, using intelligence gathered from broken Japanese codes. Every movement of the enemy fleet had been anticipated, every tactical decision predicted. Now, as American dive bombers descended from the morning sky like vengeful angels, the tide of war in the Pacific was about to turn. According to Walter Lord's definitive account in Incredible Victory, published by Harper and Row in 1967, the Japanese command structure that morning resembled a symphony orchestra, where each section was playing from different sheet music. The rigid hierarchy that had served Japan so well in previous battles now worked against them, as contradictory orders cascaded down from Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto aboard the super battleship Yamato, hundreds of miles away, to the tactical commanders, who could see the enemy approaching but couldn't make decisive moves without approval. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leading Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, pressed his attack despite knowing his obsolete Douglas Devastator torpedo. Bombers were flying into certain death. His radio crackled with determination. "We'll go in and get a hit regardless of the consequences." Behind him, 15 young aviators followed their commander into the teeth of Japanese anti-aircraft fire, their sacrifice buying precious minutes for the dive bombers that would follow. The Japanese carriers began evasive maneuvers, but their formations had already been disrupted. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu shouted orders as his ship heeled hard to starboard, but the complex dance of fleet movements that had characterized Japanese naval tactics was becoming a chaotic scramble for survival. Radio communications broke down as each ship's captain made independent decisions, the unified command that Admiral Yamamoto had envisioned dissolving into individual acts of desperation. As the first American bombs began to fall, striking the wooden flight decks with devastating effect, Nagumo realized that the Empire's carefully constructed Pacific strategy was burning along with his aircraft. The fractured command structure that had seemed so manageable in the planning rooms of Tokyo was proving fatal in the crucible of actual combat, where split-second decisions meant the difference between victory and catastrophe. The communication breakdown aboard the Japanese fleet reached catastrophic proportions as the morning progressed. Admiral Nagumo found himself trapped between conflicting directives from the combined fleet headquarters and the rapidly evolving tactical situation before his eyes. Each radio message from Admiral Yamamoto aboard the distant Yamato seemed to contradict the previous one, while the American attacks intensified with each passing minute. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, lay wounded in the sickbay of the Akagi as his ship burned around him. The irony was not lost on him. The same tactical brilliance that had delivered Japan's greatest naval victory was now being used against them by an enemy that had learned from defeat. Through the porthole, he could see the smoke rising from the Kaga, her flight deck a twisted mass of metal and flame. The Japanese fighter screen, once considered invincible, found itself overwhelmed by the sheer audacity of the American assault. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, leading the Akagi's fighter wing, screamed orders into his radio as he watched Douglas Dauntless dive bombers pierce through his defensive perimeter. The Mitsubishi Zero fighters, despite their superior maneuverability, couldn't be everywhere at once, and the Americans had learned to exploit their weaknesses. Aboard the Enterprise, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance maintained the calm demeanor that would become legendary among his subordinates. Unlike his Japanese counterparts, who were receiving contradictory orders from multiple levels of command, Spruance had been given clear operational authority by Admiral Nimitz. His communications flowed smoothly down the chain of command, each ship's captain knowing exactly what was expected of him. The Japanese command confusion reached its peak when Admiral Nagumo received simultaneous orders to retreat, advance, and prepare for a surface engagement. The rigid military hierarchy that demanded unquestioning obedience to superiors had become a liability when those superiors were hundreds of miles away and operating on outdated information. Each precious minute spent awaiting clarification allowed the Americans to press their advantage. As referenced in Gordon Pranga's comprehensive study, Miracle at Midway, published by McGraw-Hill in 1982, the Japanese command structure suffered from what military analysts would later term decision paralysis, the inability to act decisively when faced with information that contradicted predetermined plans. Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson, piloting his Dauntless dive bomber from the Enterprise, watched in amazement as Japanese ships broke formation without apparent coordination. What should have been a disciplined withdrawal looked more like a rout as individual captains made desperate attempts to save their vessels. The carefully choreographed naval ballet that had characterized Japanese operations since the war's beginning had devolved into improvisational chaos. Captain Jisaku Okada of the Kaga found his ship's communication systems destroyed by the first wave of American bombs, cutting him off from both fleet command and his escort vessels. Isolated and burning, he made the agonizing decision to abandon his coordinated defense plan and focus solely on damage control. The decision, made independently of higher command, probably saved hundreds of lives but contributed to the overall breakdown of Japanese fleet cohesion. The contrast with American coordination was stark. Admiral Fletcher, despite being wounded and having his flagship Yorktown damaged, maintained constant communication with Spruance aboard the Enterprise. Their tactical decisions complemented each other seamlessly, creating the kind of unified command structure that the Japanese had enjoyed at Pearl Harbor, but had somehow lost in the confusion of Midway. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting harsh light on the burning Japanese carriers, it became clear that the fracturing of command authority was proving as deadly to the Imperial Navy as any American bomb or torpedo. The second wave of American attack struck the Japanese fleet like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 37 Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, had been searching for the enemy carriers for over an hour when he spotted the telltale wake of a Japanese destroyer racing to rejoin the main fleet. Following that white line across the blue Pacific, he led his squadron directly to their target. The scene that greeted McCluskey's eyes defied belief. All 4 Japanese carriers were clustered together, their flight decks crowded with aircraft, being hastily rearmed and refueled. It was a dive bomber pilot's dream, and Admiral Nagumo's worst nightmare. The tactical concentration that should have provided mutual protection had instead created a target-rich environment where a single successful attack could cripple multiple vessels simultaneously. Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge of the Akagi, his face a mask of stoic acceptance, as he watched the American dive bombers enter their attack runs. The communication chaos that had plagued his fleet all morning had prevented the kind of coordinated defense that might have saved his ships. Anti-aircraft guns fired independently, without the central fire control that could have created an impenetrable wall of steel and explosive. The first bomb struck the Kaga at 11:26 a.m., penetrating the wooden flight deck and exploding among the armed aircraft below. The chain reaction was instantaneous and devastating. Aviation gasoline ignited, creating a wall of flame that swept across the hangar deck, while secondary explosions sent aircraft parts and burning fuel in all directions. Captain Jisaku Okada, already struggling with communication failures, found his ship transformed into a floating inferno. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led his bombing squadron from the Yorktown in a coordinated attack on the Soryu. The precision of the American assault stood in stark contrast to the confusion aboard the Japanese vessels. Each pilot knew his target, his approach vector, and his escape route. The months of intensive training following Pearl Harbor had created a level of tactical coordination that the Japanese command structure, paralyzed by hierarchical confusion, simply could not match. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto of the Soryu watched helplessly as 3,000-pound bombs struck his ship in rapid succession. The first penetrated the forward elevator, the second destroyed the bridge structure, and the third ignited the aviation fuel storage compartments. Within minutes, his proud carrier was listing heavily to port, her superstructure wreathed in smoke and flame. Cut off from fleet communications, he made the lonely decision to prepare for abandonment, without waiting for orders from Admiral Nagumo. The Akagi herself, flagship of the Pearl Harbor Strike Force, received 3 direct hits that sealed her fate. The first bomb struck near the midship elevator. The second penetrated the hangar deck among dozens of fueled and armed aircraft, and the third destroyed the ship's island structure. Admiral Nagumo, his uniform singed and his face blackened by smoke, was forcibly evacuated to the cruiser Nagara as his flagship burned behind him. As documented in Mitsuo Fuchida's first-hand account, Midway, the battle that doomed Japan, published by Naval Institute Press in 1955, the coordinated American attack achieved in 6 minutes what months of previous Pacific warfare had failed to accomplish: the systematic destruction of Japanese naval aviation superiority. The Dassel communication breakdown that had plagued the Japanese fleet all morning reached its ultimate expression as 3 of the 4 carriers burned simultaneously. Individual ship captains, unable to coordinate with fleet command or each other, made independent decisions about damage control, evacuation, and scuttling. The unified command that had made the Pearl Harbor attack possible had completely disintegrated under the pressure of American tactical superiority and superior intelligence. Lieutenant Commander Richard Best, leading his dive bomber squadron from the Enterprise, delivered the coup de grace to the Akagi with a single 1,000-pound bomb that penetrated deep into the ship's vitals. As he pulled out of his dive and banked away from the burning carrier, he could see the entire Japanese formation breaking apart, individual ships fleeing in all directions without coordination or central command. The afternoon brought no respite for the shattered Japanese fleet as Admiral Spruance pressed his advantage with relentless determination. The sole surviving carrier Hiryu, under the command of Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, launched a desperate counterattack against the American task force, but the damage to Japanese command coordination proved irreversible. Without the other 3 carriers to provide fighter cover and reconnaissance, Yamaguchi found himself fighting a battle he could not win. The Hiryu's attack aircraft, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, managed to locate and damage the Yorktown, in a display of the tactical skill that had made Japanese naval aviation legendary. However, the success was Pyrrhic. The scattered nature of the attack, launched without proper coordination with the rest of the fleet, meant that individual Japanese squadrons were picked apart by concentrated American fighter defenses. The unity of command that had characterized Japanese operations since Pearl Harbor was gone, replaced by isolated acts of heroism that could not alter the battle's outcome. Admiral Fletcher, wounded but still commanding from the damaged Yorktown, demonstrated the kind of flexible command, authority that had been missing from the Japanese side all day. When his flagship began listing severely from torpedo damage, he smoothly transferred operational control to Admiral Spruance aboard the Enterprise without missing a tactical beat. The American command structure bent, but did not break, maintaining the coordination that would prove decisive. The contrast with the Japanese situation was stark and telling. Admiral Nagumo, rescued from the burning Akagi but isolated aboard the cruiser Nagara, found himself cut off from meaningful tactical control. His communications with the distant Admiral Yamamoto remained sporadic and confused, while his ability to coordinate with the surviving ships of his fleet had been virtually eliminated. The rigid hierarchy that had seemed so effective in peacetime operations proved catastrophically inadequate under combat conditions. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, despite being wounded and low on fuel, led the final American strike against the Hiryu as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The attack was a masterpiece of tactical coordination, with dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters working in perfect harmony. Each pilot knew exactly what was expected of him, and the result was the systematic destruction of Japan's last operational carrier in the Pacific. As referenced in Samuel Eliot Morrison's authoritative History of United States Naval Operations, in World War II, published by Little Brown and Company in 1949, the Battle of Midway represented not just a tactical victory for American forces, but a fundamental demonstration of the superiority of flexible command structures over rigid hierarchical systems under combat stress. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi, standing on the bridge of the doomed Hiryu as American bombs rained down around him, made the final gesture of the old Japanese naval tradition. Rather than abandon his ship, he chose to go down with her, taking personal responsibility for the failure of the rigid command system that had served Japan so poorly this day. His death symbolized not just personal honor, but the end of Japanese naval supremacy in the Pacific. The communication breakdown that had begun with contradictory orders that morning had evolved into complete tactical paralysis by afternoon. Individual Japanese ship captains, lacking coordination with fleet command or each other, made desperate independent decisions that further fragmented an already shattered force structure. Some attempted to rescue survivors, others fled toward Japan, and still others prepared for suicidal surface attacks that would never materialize. As the sun set on June 4, 1942, 4 of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers lay burning or sunk in the Central Pacific. The command structure that had delivered stunning victories across the Pacific for 6 months had collapsed under pressure, while American tactical flexibility and superior intelligence had created a coordination advantage that proved decisive. The rising sun was setting on Japanese naval dominance, and the fractured command that had begun the day would never fully recover its effectiveness. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood in the operations room aboard the super battleship Yamato, 300 miles northwest of the burning carriers, as reports filtered in of the catastrophic defeat unfolding at Midway. The architect of Pearl Harbor found himself trapped by the same rigid command structure that had initially served him so well. His fleet was scattered across thousands of square miles of ocean, with individual task groups operating under conflicting orders and deteriorating communication. The irony was not lost on the brilliant strategist who had warned his superiors that Japan could run wild in the Pacific for only 6 months to a year before American industrial might turn the tide. That prediction was proving grimly accurate, as his carefully orchestrated plan collapsed into chaos. Each radio message from the battle zone brought worse news, and his ability to influence events diminished with every passing hour. Captain Kameto Kuroshima, Yamamoto's chief of staff, struggled to maintain coherent communication with the scattered elements of the combined fleet. The complex battle plan that had seemed so elegant in the war rooms of Tokyo was proving impossible to coordinate across the vast distances of the Pacific. Surface ships, submarines, and the remaining aircraft were operating independently, their original missions obsolete, but new orders impossible to transmit effectively. The fundamental flaw in Japanese naval doctrine became clear as the day progressed. The system that demanded absolute obedience to superior authority worked well when communications remained intact and situations developed according to plan. However, when communications broke down and the unexpected occurred, junior commanders found themselves paralyzed, unable to act without explicit orders from superiors who were too distant to understand the rapidly changing tactical situation. Yamamoto faced an agonizing decision as reports confirmed the loss of all 4 fleet carriers. His remaining forces, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, still outnumbered and outgunned the American fleet, but they were scattered across the ocean without air cover. The surface engagement he had originally planned as a follow-up to the carrier battle was no longer feasible without aerial reconnaissance and fighter protection. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, Admiral Nimitz's intelligence officer at Pearl Harbor, monitored Japanese radio traffic from his communications center, watching in real time as the enemy command structure disintegrated. The broken Japanese codes that had made the American victory possible continued to provide insights into the confusion aboard Yamamoto's flagship. Each intercepted message revealed another aspect of the coordination breakdown that was amplifying the tactical defeat into a strategic catastrophe. The psychological impact on Japanese morale became evident as individual ship captains began requesting permission to withdraw independently. The aggressive spirit that had characterized Japanese naval operations since Pearl Harbor was evaporating under the weight of systematic defeat and communication chaos. Officers who had never known defeat found themselves unable to comprehend the magnitude of what was happening, as documented in Mitsuo Fuchida and Masatake Okumiya's collaborative work, Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan, the Japanese Navy's story. Published by Naval Institute Press in 1955, Admiral Yamamoto's headquarters received over 200 conflicting situation reports during the afternoon of June 4th, making coherent command decisions virtually impossible. The decision to retreat, when it finally came, reflected the complete breakdown of the Japanese command system. Rather than a coordinated withdrawal that might have salvaged some tactical advantage, the order resulted in a chaotic flight toward Japan, with each task group choosing its own route and timing. The unified fleet that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier was now a collection of individual ships, fleeing independently across the Pacific. Yamamoto's personal anguish was evident to his staff, as he realized that his strategic gamble had not only failed, but had handed the Americans a decisive advantage in the Pacific War. The fractured command that had begun with contradictory orders that morning had evolved into a complete collapse of Japanese naval coordination. The rising Sun Fleet that had dominated the Pacific was retreating in disorder, its command authority shattered, and its tactical coherence destroyed. The communication systems that had failed so catastrophically during the battle continued to hamper Japanese efforts to assess their losses and coordinate their retreat. As night fell on June 4th, Admiral Yamamoto knew that Japan had lost more than 4 aircraft carriers. It had lost the initiative in the Pacific War, and the fractured command structure ensured that regaining it would be virtually impossible. Theos, night of June 4th brought no peace to the scattered Japanese fleet, as communication breakdowns continued to plague every aspect of the retreat. Admiral Yamamoto, still aboard the Yamato, found himself receiving fragmentary reports from scattered task groups, each telling a different version of the disaster. The fog of war, amplified by the breakdown in command coordination, made it impossible to assess the true extent of Japanese losses or coordinate an effective withdrawal. Captain Watanabe of the destroyer Tanikaze exemplified the confusion that gripped the retreating fleet. Separated from his task group during the chaotic afternoon battle, he found himself alone in the Central Pacific with conflicting orders from 3 different superior officers. The rigid command structure that had served Japan so well in previous engagements now worked against survival as individual commanders waited for authorization that would never come. The rescue operations for survivors from the sunken carriers revealed the full extent of the coordination breakdown. Ships that should have been working together to save lives instead operated independently, with some vessels abandoning rescue efforts prematurely due to fear of submarine attack while others lingered too long in dangerous waters. The lack of unified command authority meant that hundreds of skilled aircrew and naval personnel, who might have been saved, were instead left to perish in the Pacific swells. Commander Minoru Genda, wounded but alive after the sinking of the Akagi, floated in the oil-slicked water as darkness fell, witnessing firsthand the chaos that had replaced Japanese naval precision. The destroyers and cruisers that should have been conducting coordinated search and rescue operations instead moved erratically through the night, their captains operating on incomplete information and contradictory orders. The teamwork that had made the Pearl Harbor attack possible had completely disintegrated. Meanwhile, Admiral Spruance maintained his pursuit of the retreating Japanese fleet with the same methodical precision that had characterized American operations all day. His communication with Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor remained clear and consistent, allowing for tactical adjustments based on real-time intelligence. The contrast with Japanese command chaos was stark and decisive. While Yamamoto struggled to maintain contact with his scattered forces, Spruance knew the exact position and status of every ship under his command. The psychological impact of the communication breakdown extended beyond immediate tactical concerns. Japanese naval officers, trained from childhood to believe in the superiority of their fleet and the invincibility of their command system, found themselves confronting the reality that their entire strategic framework had been based on false assumptions. The fractured communications that plagued their retreat served as a constant reminder of institutional failure. As detailed in Walter Lord's meticulously researched account, Incredible Victory, published by Harper and Row in 1967, Japanese radio operators worked frantically through the night to re-establish contact with scattered elements of their fleet. But the damage to communication equipment during the day's attacks, combined with the vast distances involved, made coordination virtually impossible. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort, working in the basement of Pearl Harbor's intelligence center, continued to intercept and decode Japanese messages throughout the night. The intelligence advantage that had made the American victory possible remained intact, providing Admiral Nimitz with a clear picture of Japanese confusion and retreat, while Yamamoto remained largely blind to the movements of his own forces. The submarine I-168, commanded by Commander Yahachi Tanabe, received orders to continue reconnaissance of the American fleet, but the message arrived 12 hours late due to communication delays. By the time Tanabe could act on his instructions, the tactical situation had changed completely, rendering his mission obsolete. This pattern repeated throughout the Japanese fleet as the breakdown in command coordination made real-time tactical adjustment impossible. As dawn approached on June 5th, the full magnitude of the command failure became clear. The Japanese fleet, once the most precisely coordinated naval force in the world, was scattered across thousands of square miles of ocean, with individual commanders making independent decisions based on hours-old information. The fractured command structure that had begun with contradictory orders 24 hours earlier had evolved into complete institutional paralysis, ensuring that Japan's defeat at Midway would have lasting strategic consequences far beyond the loss of 4 aircraft carriers. The morning of June 5, 1942 dawned clear and bright over the Central Pacific, revealing the full extent of the transformation that had taken place in just 24 hours. Where the previous day had seen the Japanese combined fleet advancing in perfect formation toward what seemed certain victory, now only scattered groups of ships fled westward toward Japan, their command structure shattered and their tactical cohesion destroyed forever. Admiral Spruance, maintaining his methodical pursuit of the retreating enemy, exemplified the new reality of Pacific naval warfare. His communications remained crystal clear. His tactical decisions were based on current intelligence, and his fleet operated as a unified force under centralized command. The contrast with Japanese confusion could not have been more stark or more decisive. While Yamamoto struggled to locate his own scattered forces, Spruance knew the position and condition of every enemy ship within 300 miles. The final act of the tragedy unfolded when the heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma, fleeing the Diwa battle zone under independent command, collided during the night due to communication failures. The accident, which would normally have been a minor setback requiring coordinated damage control, became a disaster when the ship's captains could not establish effective communication with fleet headquarters or each other. Both vessels limped westward alone, easy targets for American aircraft that struck them repeatedly throughout the morning. Captain Akira Soji of the Mikuma fought valiantly to save his ship, but the isolation imposed by the breakdown in Japanese command authority made effective damage control impossible. Without coordination with other vessels, without air cover, and without clear orders from higher authority, he could only watch as his cruiser gradually succumbed to American attacks. His death, along with most of his crew, symbolized the end of an era in Japanese naval warfare. The intelligence coup that had made the American victory possible continued to pay dividends as the battle's aftermath unfolded. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton's team at Pearl Harbor intercepted increasingly desperate Japanese communications, providing Admiral Nimitz with a clear picture of enemy casualties, morale problems, and strategic confusion. The broken codes that had revealed Japanese plans before Midway now exposed the full extent of their defeat and disorganization. Admiral Yamamoto, finally reaching the relative safety of Japanese home waters, began the agonizing process of reporting the disaster to Imperial headquarters in Tokyo. The rigid hierarchy that had contributed so significantly to the tactical breakdown now forced him to explain how the invincible combined fleet had been defeated by an enemy that Japan had supposedly crippled at Pearl Harbor. The fractured command that had begun with communication problems had evolved into a crisis of institutional confidence that would plague Japanese naval operations for the remainder of the war. The strategic implications of the command breakdown extended far beyond the immediate tactical defeat. Japanese naval aviation, the sword and shield of the Empire's Pacific strategy, had lost not just 4 carriers and their aircraft, but the irreplaceable cadre of experienced pilots and maintenance personnel who had made those ships effective. The rigid training system that had produced such skilled aviators could not quickly replace what had been lost, ensuring that Japan would never again achieve the tactical coordination that had characterized the early months of the Pacific War. As referenced in Gordon Pranga's comprehensive analysis, Miracle at Midway, published by McGraw-Hill in 1982, the Battle of Midway represented a fundamental shift in the nature of Pacific naval warfare, transforming it from a contest between individual ships and aircraft to a battle between competing command and communication systems. The morning sun of June 5th illuminated a transformed Pacific theater where American tactical flexibility, superior intelligence, and unified command had permanently replaced Japanese precision, surprise, and hierarchical control as the dominant paradigm. The fractured Japanese command that had begun as a series of communication problems had evolved into a strategic catastrophe that would influence every subsequent naval engagement of the Pacific War. As the surviving elements of the Japanese fleet limped back toward their home bases, they carried with them not just the wounded and the memories of fallen comrades, but the knowledge that their entire system of naval warfare had been found wanting in the crucible of combat. The rising sun that had seemed so bright over Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier was now setting on an empire that would spend the remainder of the war fighting desperately to avoid the consequences of a single day, when their command fractured and Midway struck from every angle. The transformation was complete. America had learned to fight as effectively as Japan had once fought, while Japan had forgotten how to fight at all.